All right, welcome back. So the title of this mini lecture is the 1960s, and we're going to talk about 5 things that you need to know as you go to research and read about this very interesting decade. All right, so there's a lot here. It is very conflicted. Some view it as a great time of fracturing the status quo and America becoming more inclusive, which is awesome. But others, folks view it as a time of real, moral decay and disaster, and cats and dogs living together, and that kind of thing. So it's a pretty big one. So let's get into it. All right. So 5 things you got to be knowing, got to be thinking about. All right. Number 1, Barry Goldwater. All right, so Barry Goldwater was a United States senator. He was a senator in Arizona who gets the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1964. So yes, there were Republicans in the 60s, and yes, they existed, and and Goldwater is significant because he really reflected this new wave of conservatism that was hitting the United States in the early to mid 1960s, and it's only going to grow as the 60s go on. We tend to forget about it because there's not as much drugs and other countercultural stuff, and their hair is a little bit more straight and narrow. But conservatism is a big deal, particularly in the 60s, and Barry Goldwater is kind of your guy there. All right, number 2, SDS, or Students for a Democratic Society. So let's say you're white, let's say you're upper middle class, let's say you're a college student, and you nominally think that the Vietnam War is bad, and you think that civil rights is good. You're probably going to end up joining the SDS on a college campus in the first half of the 60s. So this was kind of the broad-based, new left, white upper middle class, sort of organization for kind of the politicization of the counterculture. So they support some things, they don't support other things. SDS isn't perfect. There's some issues with gender equity and racial equity. By the end of the 60s, they split off to become the Weathermen. Also, they start dabbling in anarchism. But the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. Third, the British invasion. No, it's not military, but it is pop culture. So 1963, 64, 65, you start to see the popularity of the Beatles grow, then the Rolling Stones, and with them come many other different bands and artists from across the Atlantic Ocean to the U.S. pop cultural airwaves. When the Beatles appear on the Ed Sullivan Show in early 1964, it's tens of millions of people really sort of marking this sort of time or ascendancy for youth culture in America. So the British invasion was a big part of that. Number 4, Catherine Switzer. Catherine Switzer. So we don't often discuss the issues of gender equity and women's rights as much as we should in the 60s. And there's a heck of a lot of individuals that we could talk about from Shirley Chisholm later in the 60s and 70s to certainly Gloria Steinem, from Betty Friedan, many folks. Since I used to run a lot. Catherine Switzer, I think, is really cool to know. So she was the first woman to run as in the Boston Marathon. Signed up, got her number and everything, and ran in the Boston Marathon. The lead director of the Boston Marathon tried to kick her out. They had to kind of knock him off the course. This is in like 67. Really kind of highlighting the issues of equity for women, particularly in sports. So Catherine Switzer, she's cool. Number 5, the draft. The draft. Okay, so whether you're for or against the Vietnam War, if you're a guy in the 1960s, by and large, you have to be concerned. If you are a young man coming of age in the 60s, you have to be concerned about the draft. So if you're going to go to college, if you end up married, if you have kids, are you going to end up with a deferment? Are you not? Are you going to volunteer and go? This for men in the 60s, for young men in the 60s, regardless of your politics or your economic background, this was a big deal. Now, my own father was drafted and he fought in Vietnam, but disproportionately, the way that it tended to work was those who tended to be drafted, who tended to end up serving, in forward units in country. You're disproportionately young. Average age 19, 20, 21 years old, usually not 19, disproportionately working class, disproportionately not well educated, and from communities of color usually. All right, thanks so much.